Hello everybody and welcome back to artofdino.com and saveearth.us, and here's another one that leans more towards the Save Earth section, and it is all about, again, the food that we eat. You are what you eat, and this is from the El Paso Herald from around 1911. So, wow. Dr. H.W. Lathrop of Wisconsin University wrote an article called Why a Nation's Brains and Ideals Are Made Up Only of the Food They Eat. And wow, it's a good one. And you are what you eat is an ancient quote. Who knows who said it truly? But I've always said it, and I've been telling people that all the time because no one seems to get it. Everyone in America is kind of under the impression, and I was for about the first 20-something years of my life, not anymore, thank God, for about at least 2 decades now, almost. But a lot of people are under the influence that the food they eat does not matter. And these are the same people that will eat a tiny pill of something that will do something totally overwhelming to them. But they'll consume tons and pounds of food that is just pure garbage, loaded with chemicals, and they won't think it has any effect on them. People have been convinced that, speed of eating and wasting less time is more important than actually what goes into you. There's a huge disconnect in America, especially as we are a country where only certain foods are allowed to be eaten here, and they are banned all over the world, but not here for some weird reason, because they're loaded with chemicals and they make people rich. So this is a very interesting article, as well as nowadays it's compared to articles about Bill Gates's fake meat and how that causes cancer, and it's pretty much grown as a cancer, and then you eat it, and it's ridiculous. And I've been a vegan for a long time, and sometimes I will eat eggs occasionally if they're from a good source. But a lot of people, and I've been trying to come up with a good kind of solution for eating with people, but it seems tough, and it's because everybody, no matter where you're from, you've got a different system that you're working with, and your DNA and whatever you're used to is different in everyone. So things that work for some people may not work for others, but either way, chemicals and poisons don't work for anyone. And these things that they're putting in the fake meats also do not work for anyone. Bugs do not work for humans. All of this stuff. And what if we are what we eat? What are we going to be when we've consumed so many chemicals in the candies that kids eat, in the soft drinks, the energy drinks? Every single thing that's consumed in America and that you find in pretty much all major grocery stores is garbage. And people in America have become so used to it, they're numb to it. People will get their stomachs tied so they don't eat, or take pills so that they eat less, but they'll still eat the same amount, and they'll still eat the same garbage, and they won't even think twice. And if you try to tell them, hey, that's poisonous, that natural flavors in there could be anything from a beaver's anal gland to who knows what, they're not telling you, and they'll be like, yeah, okay, sure. Very few people actually say, oh my God, that's gross, I'm never going to eat anything with that again. But they need to. Americans need to start doing that. So I'm going to pick some of the paragraphs from this article and read some of this, because it is important to get out there. And you have to. And again, I'm not a meat eater. I don't eat meat for many reasons. The compassion element, I feel like is a very strong one. And I ate meat for a long time, and I had a bad back. I had sore throats all the time. I was sick way more constantly. Once I stopped eating meat and dairy, all of those problems went away. From my back to my lungs to everything went away, and I had more energy and more focus. So many different things. So that's for me. That's what worked for me. And I always and I don't. A lot of people will say, oh, you need meat and the protein. That's their coded kind of pre-programmed saying. But there's a lot of proteins in many other vegetables and so many other things. And they've convinced everyone that the meat from protein from meat is superior, but it is not. It's not designed for your body. It's not designed for your gut. And you'll see that even in this article. And again, I'm not telling people what to eat, but I would, if I was in a situation where I was starving and there was an animal that was pure and in nature, I would be more, then I would probably pray to that animal or do something to honor it. And if I had to eat it, I would. And that's a lot different than getting store ground meat in Walmart. There's a huge difference between finding a meat in nature that's been grown and living naturally and existing naturally, or on a farm that's organic, or a farm that actually cares for their animals, as opposed to a massive slaughterhouse in some foreign country where God knows what the animals are eating, God knows what conditions they're in, God knows how many problems it encountered on its way from you, how many times it thawed, how many times it got worms, how many times it's been painted by chemicals, how many times it's been bleeding and rotting, and how many worms have been dewormed. There's so many problems. So that's why I don't eat meat, because I don't trust a thing from the American suppliers. Not one thing. And there's no way to argue with that. You can't say that protein from a Mexican meat farm is just as good as organic broccoli's protein or from legumes or mushrooms. So that argument of the brainwashed should be solved here. But I've gone on enough of a tirade here. It's been years of me dealing with people who just continue to not get it. So I've got a lot to kind of get off my... I've got a lot to think about and passionately and talk about in this topic. And I really want people to learn this, because if everybody got on the same page, we could bankrupt a lot of these chemical companies in weeks. They would change their ways so quick. And there's even some congressmen who are talking about getting rid of dyes, getting rid of high fructose corn syrup, getting rid of all these things. But there still always will be the pesticides and all the other problems. And we have to stop these trends before these freaks start feeding us disgusting, even more disgusting things like bugs. You never know. Because again, if we are what we eat, do we really want to eat bugs? So here we go. Here is the article, Why a Nation's Brains and Ideals Are Made Up Only of the Food They Eat. Tell me what a nation eats, and I will tell you what its character is. That, in effect, is the claim of the famous German philosopher Nietzsche, and recent medical research tends to hear him out. In his work entitled The Gay Science, a translation of which has recently been published, he declares that Buddhism, for instance, may to a large extent be attributed to the excessive and almost exclusive rice fare of the Indian people. Such a fare, he contends, results in universal enervation and impels to the use of opium and narcotics. Potatoes eaten excessively excite a craving for brandy. In short, national habits and modes of thought and feeling may be directly traced to national food habits, and as a nation eats, so it thinks and acts. And if this has been discovered, you bet your butt that the governments know about it, and that's why America is being poisoned to dust. With regard to meat, for instance, it is well known that it is not only a food, but also a stimulant, and physiologists agree that the use of one form of stimulant evokes a craving for others. The English partiality for roast beef is directly responsible for the national indulgence in alcoholic drinks. The more meat a nation eats, the more beer, whiskey, and rum it will consume. Try to prove that wrong. That the use of narcotics by the Chinese, Japanese, and Indians in their fatalistic views of life may be directly traced to the fact that rice is the principal staple of their diet is conceded by medical investigators. It must not be understood, however, that there is anything undesirable in rice as a food, the lamentable consequences in the case of the Orientals being their excessive use of that article as a food and the consequent lack of meat and other protein-containing foods in their diet. Rice is a good food containing 87% of nutriment, but it is not all sufficient. It contains but a very small proportion of protein, the stimulating factor in meat. Without the stimulus for stimulants, which meat provides, a people subsisting upon a starchy diet incline to the opposite extreme and crave narcotics. Herbert Spencer adopted vegetarianism by way of experiment, but after a year he was so struck by the deterioration of his literary output during that period that he gave it up. So now I had the exact opposite effect. So again, all these articles aren't always universal. It has been observed, too, that vegetarians who have, before adopting that regimen, been moderate drinkers and smokers very often lose, wholly or in part, the taste for alcoholic beverages or tobacco. This happened to me. After I stopped eating meat, I completely lost the ability or my desire to drink. And I don't drink any more than 2 or 3, max 4 beers at a celebration nowadays. I don't need it. Before that, I drank a lot more. So I agree with this again. If the adoption of a vegetarian diet so speedily overcomes the craving for stimulants, it is not difficult to understand how a prolonged national diet of rice or other protein-lacking foods may have the opposite effect and make a people indolent, fatalistic, and narcotic slaves. Oh my God. 1911. The most general national error in diet seems to be a lack of balance. Food has 2 functions, to build and repair body tissue and to furnish energy. For the first essential, foods containing nitrogenous material, such for instance as lean meat, egg white, and the gluten of wheat, must be eaten, while for the other essential, the body requires foods containing fats and carbohydrates. The average man requires about 5 times as much energy producing food as tissue building food, and unless a national diet is based upon this proportion, it is deficient, and the error is bound in time to show itself in the national character. The average man, for instance, should eat sufficient lean meat, eggs, and bread per day to furnish him with 1/4 pound of protein or tissue-building material, and sufficient cereals, vegetables, butter, and fat to supply his body with 1¼ pounds of fat and carbohydrates or energy-producing elements. So again, this is a doctor. He could be corrupt. He could be working with the companies. You never know. Back then, you never know now. Whenever you hear an opinion of someone, there's usually some type of motivation behind it. So again, as with most articles in papers, there's a little bit of truth and then a lot of other stuff you have to sift through. Keep it going. To take more than the required amount of protein into the system will not only do no good, but in the majority of cases results in positive harm. And the same is true of the energy-producing constituents of food. Take a look at your GNCs and see all the protein that people have been duped into getting constantly. I know so many people who have been on protein supplements and they constantly complain about their stomachs being out of whack, their the weird things that end up happening to them, the smells, all this nasty stuff. Duh. The food of a nation is determined to a large extent by circumstances. A people whose natural food resources enable it to select a well-balanced diet develops physically and mentally under the most favorable auspices. Boom. Whereas a nation whose food selection is limited is bound eventually to deteriorate. America. Thus the Indians of North America lived not alone by hunting and fishing, but cultivated a number of food plants on an extensive scale, and everything they ate was pure. Maize, being beans, pumpkins, and sunflowers were the most common crops, Indian corn being easily first. All kinds of animals, birds, fish, and shellfish were eaten, and large supplies of such animal foods were dried and smoked for winter use. Bear fat and animal fats generally were collected in quantity, as was oil from the sunflower seed, and on the whole, the diet of this race was well balanced and calculated to bring out the best qualities latent in the noble red man. So again, another main important thing about diets nowadays is the oils. There are so many disgusting oils that come from waste products, and you would be absolutely horrified at the process used by a lot of the oils, like canola oil, rapeseed oil, God knows what. Even sunflower oil I don't think is very healthy because of the process, and probably the flowers that they get them from are probably very GMO, very overproduced, very chemical ridden from pesticides. So again, that is a very important thing, because as there's more and more people and you go on things, you go to vacations, you go on restaurants, you go to places where they're feeding a lot of people, they're going to use cheaper and cheaper and cheaper oils, and you will suffer for it. So beware of that. Other races, however, were less fortunate. In the Arctic regions, at the present time, as in the past, the food is always exclusively animal, because that is the only sort that is available in quantity. In the tropics, again, where vegetable food is abundant and animal foods readily decay, plant products are and always have been of very great importance in the diet. It's actually kind of funny, too. It makes me think, there's all these different crops that grow in different things. Like apples, for instance, were an old form of fruit that's been around forever, and there used to be thousands of varieties, and depending on how, it's like tea, depending on how high it's grown or where it's grown, what water it's used, all those different things yields a completely different flavor, a style, a breed. All these different things can be altered. And so people are the same way. Wherever we have our past, we have our genetic material in our past that tells us, where we inevitably came from, which guides us towards which foods and what things are best for us. But then we've been moved all over the place like a melting pot. So we all are in different places, and we're all eating the food of our local zones, which may not vibe with where our spirit and ancient selves are from. So that's another problem we all face, because we're all kind of fed similar stuff. Even though there's a lot of options, we're all which are all chemical poisoned in America, that still is we're still all doing a diet that's different, most likely, than where our true origins are from. So last couple paragraphs says, in India, where the natives subsist on a diet low in protein and rich in energy, the inhabitants are poorly developed physically, and their general condition is less satisfactory than that of Anglo-Indians and other colonists who live under similar conditions but on a more generous diet. The same has been noticed in China and Japan too. What is true of the development of national character as a result of food habits is true, though to a lesser extent, perhaps in the case of individuals, and scientific investigators have recently been looking into the relation between limited diet and retarded or arrested development in the case of individuals. Dr. C.F. Langworthy, the government expert in charge of nutrition investigations in the Department of Agriculture, recently made a special report on food customs and diet in the American homes. I wonder if he was legit or if he was a scumbag. If you had that kind of person now in our government, they would be guaranteed to be filth. The fact that the food supply materiality influences the animal body, he said, is of particular importance in respect to the diet of young children, and clearly shows that there is good reason for the general belief that in childhood the diet should be generous as well as composed of suitable food materials. Fortunately for the United States, the question of physical deterioration cannot be raised with reference to the people as a whole. The large capacity for useful labor and the high average reached as to the grade of work performed are conceded by careful students of this subject in this country and elsewhere. The comparatively high standard as regards family and community hygiene and sanitation and other similar factors undoubtedly have a bearing on these questions, but no one can doubt that diet exercises an influence which is certainly not less great than any other single factor, and the American diet as a whole is varied and liberal. And poisoned, I'll add at the end, toxic. But it was probably different back in 1911. Although even whenever I go to old recipes of my grandmother, I see the same things like flavor of something, blah, blah, blah. So they've been doing this for so long. It got to be at least definitely at 1911, they were starting to corrupt the food. I wish we could just go back and see what the ancient food was. And they had it right. The Native Americans, that's a different story when the entire world is abundant with animals, with beautiful plants. There's no chemtrails. The weather's normal. The water's in the springs that are feeding all the animals are pure. The river water's pure. Everything's pure. It's totally different than what it is now. We are now the product of a chemical generation. Our origin is the laboratory, it seems like, for all of us, all over the world, because less and less is being grown in a healthy, sanitary, unpoisoned, untainted way, and more is being grown in just probable feces. Who knows? The disgusting lengths these people go to maximize productivity and harm as well at the same time. So this again is a topic that I will talk about more and more because it is very important, and I really need people to understand that food, you are what you eat, and it's tough to find the perfect balance. But my main recommendation, what works for me, is sticking with foods that work with you and your body. If you find something that makes you feel unhappy or miserable or gives you stomach pains of any kind or tired or anything, don't eat it again. Cut it out of your diet. If you find stuff that energizes you, makes you feel great, makes you alert, makes you aware, makes you feel on top of the world, keep buying that stuff. That's the only way, because we're all different. We all come from different sources, and we're in a world where 98% of the food supply is filth. Again, disgusting, toxic garbage. So you have to really use your discernment in this world and in this time period until it gets fixed and the world becomes pure again, or we move to a part of the realm outside this realm that is pure, whatever happens first. But either way, I wanted to share this article with you. Take from it what you will. Again, it's like every article I read, it's not meant to be taken 100% literally. You just take the little pieces and you throw away the rest. And I also just like to show these because the times constantly change. They weren't even thinking about feeding us bugs or fake meat back then. That wasn't even a slight thought on anyone's head. Nowadays, all they're talking about is fake food. The Democrats are not. There was bills in the House where the Republicans all voted to label your food and have it be known where bugs are in your food so that the consumers can know what they're eating. And all of the Democrats voted against it. What does that tell you? Who could vote against something like that? How sick and sinister do you have to be? I guess you only really have to look towards the government in America to find your answer. But Bless you all. May you choose the right food. And again, grow your own microgreens. Do whatever you can to get out of the food system here, or find the local people or the local stores that have what works best for you and continue to go with it. And spread the word to your family. The older generations they just cannot grasp this. I've been telling my family for decades, and they just still look at me like they're foolish as they put garbage in their mouth and constantly have stomach problems. So do what you can. Save your friends, save your family, save Earth. That's what we're all here to do. Again, thanks from artofdino.com and saveearth.us. Stay tuned for much more. Remember, you are what you eat, so eat well. Bless you all.